Thank you very much for this introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me and having me here today. I will present World Trade Centers as an index of modern architecture. And I would like to frame my presentation with two quotes. One is by Charles Jenks, who said that modern architecture died with the destruction of the Prodigo housing complex in 1972. The other one is by Rem Koolhaas, who compared the Twin Towers to the Concorde and said that they are modernism's apotheosis and letdown at the same time. These quotes refer to a specific turn at a specific moment in global culture and relate two buildings to this cultural change, the end and, paradoxically, at the same time, the apotheosis of modernism. In my research, I have examined the World Trade Center Twin Towers in their agency within this process of globalization that had initiated in a timely coincidence with their opening in 1973. Starting with a paradoxical imbalance between the strong frame of the Twin Towers as the World Trade Centers and the largely unknown hundreds of existing World Trade Center buildings worldwide, I analyzed this interrelation to understand why and how this proliferation of the World Trade Centers occurred. Here I would like to briefly explain that the name World Trade Center is a trademark owned by the World Trade Centers Association, a membership organization, a club based in New York, which licenses the World Trade Center name against fees to its members, the developers and operators of World Trade Centers. The World Trade Center concept was developed within the World Trade Center Department of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the public transport agency and owner and developer of the Twin Towers. In the mid-80s, the World Trade Center name has been sold for a symbolic amount of $10 from the Port Authority to the World Trade Center Association. In my analysis, I had interpreted the Twin Towers as a stabilizing agent within an unstable global cultural system, a phenomenon which I had coined World Trade Centerness. I interpreted the seriality of hundreds of World Trade Centers as a constant loop of stabilization and destabilization, and as apotheosis and letdown, or liquefaction, to speak with Zygmunt Bauman. And I described the Twin Towers as a representation of the global system as a unity. To Jean Baudrillard, for example, this representation of unity was so strong that, according to him, it even provoked the Twin Towers' violent destruction by terrorism. With destabilization, I do not at first refer to the structural and physical collapse of the buildings. I rather refer to the death of their originality, the individuality or heroism, the authorship, if you want, of that first tower by the coming seriality. By doubling the first tower with its twin, this originality and individuality is lost. So what happened around 1972, what David Harvey, along with Frederick Jameson and others, called a sea change in cultural as well as in political economic practices. Following Harvey and Jameson, the key shock that would change global culture was the end of the gold standard starting in 1971, and the beginning of a new fluctuating and interrelated global currency system. Along the baseline of this economic shock, an entire shock wave unfolded: the oil shock, an environmental crisis. The environmental shock also because the Club of Rome report Limits to Growth had just been published. The Sputnik shock a little earlier had led to an educational crisis and a space race. And then the future shock, this is the title, as you know, by the book from Alvin and Heidi Toffler that came out in 1970, that declared that the new socio-technological development as a shocking new environment. In short, to speak with Niall Ferguson, the early 1970s experienced the shock of the global, as he calls it. So to explain why and how World Trade Centers and this paradigm shift are related, I will now, in the following couple of minutes, disassemble the term World Trade Center. With world, I would describe the global cultural condition. I think this artwork by John Baldessari from 1990 captures this cultural condition quite well. One image on top of another, like two screens, two pairs, On the top, a man and a woman, shoppers, consumers. On the bottom image, two twin high-rises that merge in what seems an explosion. They might or might not collapse and lose their stability. The pair in the top seems to watch a spectacle, potentially the one that unfolds on the bottom image. One can see here several aspects of that particular global culture, which is characterized by medialization, spectacularization, iconicity, a world of meaning. One can see the instabilities that I have just described: crisis, disruption, potential collapse. The building structures represent power and stability despite breaking. Putting all this together with how these shoppers, consumers are depicted, one can think of the economic model of neoliberalism, or ideology, we can argue about this, that unfolded with the end of the gold standard, with increasing financialization, privatization, competition, commodification, consumerism. We had talked about this before today. These phenomena that I just described had a large effect on the practice of world trade and globalization. In particular, the financialization, the new era of banking pioneered by David Rockefeller from Chase Manhattan Bank, one of the initiators and developers of the Twin Towers World Trade Center. Then containerization, of course, and its effect on the transformation of port infrastructures and urban port areas, and also in the increasing risk and vulnerability by disruptions of trade flows, corridors, or policies. Then the global competition on an increasingly globalized market for consumer goods, the travel and commodification of images, and I could go on. Developed and financed by the Public Port Authority, the World Trade Center buildings in New York were conceptualized, at least that was the narrative, as a vertical port, replacing the former port area in Lower Manhattan where the port used to be. However, World Trade never took place inside the World Trade Center Twin Towers. Rather, they functioned as a symbol for World Trade, or even more a symbol of the global system. I want to use these two images to describe the center aspect of World Trade Centers. On the left, you can see the Twin Towers shortly before their opening from the perspective of the Chase Manhattan Bank headquarters, and on the right, you see the installation titled Void at the 9/11 memorial site on the footprint of the former World Trade Center Twin Towers. Center is a spatial category. So at first, one could say the World Trade Centers are the spatialization of global trade in that specific global cultural condition. In their materiality as buildings, they are place makers. At the same time, they are placeholders, since they refer to something other than or outside somewhere else. Center as a club. World Trade Center is a trademark, a commodity in itself. Every World Trade Center building is a clubhouse, not presenting World Trade, but representing a certain narrative of World Trade. A club, of course, is a closed and exclusive space. Center as seriality. The one center does not exist. In fact, World Trade Center 1 and 2 in that series do not exist anymore. They are represented by void. Paradoxically, hundreds of World Trade Centers still refer to them. So the center is never the center, it refers to another center, thus creating continuity and connectivity. At last, I want to mention one aspect, the center as space and power. It is always exclusive, since its situation defines who gets to have access and who gets to participate, and what the distances to power are. I'm closing my talk with this image of the land art installation by Agnes Dance from 1982. It is titled Wheatfield, a Confrontation. The artist has planted and harvested 2 acres of wheat on the Battery Park landfill, the landfill next to the World Trade Center Twin Towers that had been created from the soil excavated for its construction. Within the world and outside of the center, this installation, this art, offers a perspective through the binary grid of the network. It confronts representation with the present, hyperreality with the real. Also a confrontation with possible alternative worlds and ways of doing things differently than remaining within the loop of stabilizing instabilities. Thank you very much.